Emily had already refused to let the dog go when the order came down from the nurse's station: keep the K9 out of the trauma bay, keep him outside, keep him quiet. But the man on the gurney had gone pale in a way that did not match the monitors, his left hand clawing weakly toward the hallway, and the German shepherd at the doorway was shaking so hard his nails clicked against the tile. "If he leaves, my patient crashes," Emily said, not loudly, just enough for the charge nurse to hear as she snapped fresh gloves on and moved one step closer to the stretcher. The room was already crowded with noise, rolling carts, clipped commands, one resident insisting the animal had to be removed, but Emily's eyes had fixed on a detail no one else had caught: the patient's breathing changed every time the dog pulled back, shallow and panicked, then eased the moment the leash went taut again. She reached for the folder clipped to the bed rail, glanced once at the chart, then at the dog's harness, where a worn metal tag flashed under the fluorescent light. Ranger. That was the name printed on the tag, and the patient's fingers twitched toward it like he could hold on by memory alone. Emily did not look at the dog first, she looked at the man's chest, the tremor in his jaw, the way his pupils tracked without settling. Then she asked for the pulse ox to be repositioned, requested a different cuff, and lowered her voice as she leaned close enough for the patient to hear. "Ranger stays if you want to stay steady." The charge nurse started to object, but Emily was already doing the work, one hand steadying the patient's wrist, the other easing the blanket back just enough to check for the small emergency card tucked beneath it. A faded photo slipped out with it: one soldier in fatigues, one K9 at heel, both younger, both standing in front of a dust-streaked vehicle. The patient's eyes locked on the photo, and for the first time his breathing stopped fighting her. His shoulders dropped a fraction. Emily saw it, and so did the respiratory therapist beside her, who stopped arguing and silently moved the oxygen tubing out of the dog's reach. That was the first shift, not belief, not trust, but compliance born from a result everyone could see. Ranger, still trembling, pressed his chest to the bed frame and let out one low sound that was almost a whine, almost a question. The patient's hand found the edge of the blanket, then the dog's muzzle, and the monitors steadied by a few precious beats. Emily's jaw tightened. She had seen that kind of bond before, in places nobody in this hospital talked about. Her thumb brushed the corner of the faded photo, and for a split second a memory surfaced clean and sharp: a floodlit field tent, a wounded handler refusing sedatives until his dog was brought to him, a young medic with blood on her sleeves telling herself that keeping the animal close was not kindness, it was medicine. She pushed the memory away and went back to the room in front of her. "Get me a quiet corner near the bay door," she told the tech, already making the next decision. "And no one touches that leash unless I say so." The resident looked offended, then uncertain, then stepped aside when the patient's fingers tightened and his heartbeat climbed again at the hint of separation. Emily used the opening immediately. She adjusted the bed angle, raised the patient's knees a few degrees, and watched the monitor settle. The dog responded too, lowering his head, matching the room's rhythm as if he understood every adjustment. No one in the room missed that. The charge nurse, who had been ready to call security, now moved the 4-pole without being asked and made space for the dog bed to be pulled closer. It was a small action, but it changed the shape of the room. The immediate crisis was no longer whether Ranger would be allowed to stay, it was whether the staff would admit the animal had been part of keeping the patient alive all along. Emily felt the tension shift, then deepen. If Ranger remained, the hospital would have to justify it, document it, and own the choice. If they removed him, the patient might spiral. Either way, the decision would follow her, not the people who had argued loudest. She took a slow breath, checked the line in the patient's arm, and then made the call that would not be easy to walk back from: write it down as an approved support animal for this stay. I'm taking responsibility for it. The room went still for half a second at the word responsibility, not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. The patient heard it too. His eyes opened wider, and something like relief crossed his face before exhaustion pulled him back under. Ranger settled at the bedside at last, chin on the mattress, body still trembling but no longer resisting the room. Emily stayed where she was, one hand on the rail, the other on the chart, knowing that the order she had just made would bring questions she had not intended to answer. The leash lay across the blanket like a line no one could uncross. What would you do when the room was waiting for you to take the blame? Emily did not move for a beat after the words left her mouth. She kept one gloved hand on the rail, the other on the chart, and watched Ranger settle against the mattress with a shallow, uneven breath. The leash still lay across the blanket, and now it looked less like a problem and more like a decision that had already spread through the room. Mrs. Halstead, the charge nurse, had been the first to stiffen. She glanced once at the chart, once at the patient, then at Emily's face, as if trying to measure how far this would go. "If administration asks," she said quietly, "you're the one who signed it." It was not a threat. It was worse. It was reality. Emily nodded once. "I know." Her voice was level, but her thumb had started pressing into the edge of the clipboard, slow and steady, as if keeping herself anchored. At the bedside, Ranger lifted his head a few inches, ears twitching at the change in tone. He gave one small whine, then pressed his nose into the blanket beside the patient's hand. The patient, still half gone under medication, turned his fingers weakly and caught the fur. That tiny movement changed the shape of the room. It told everyone the dog was not a distraction. He was part of what was keeping the man here. A monitor beeped from the hallway, sharp and impatient, and Mrs. Halstead turned toward it with a thin exhale. "The pharmacy is going to want a note. Security will want a copy. And family will probably be here before shift change." Emily's eyes flicked to the clock. Less than 3 hours. Of course they would come now. Of course the decision would not sit quietly. She stepped to the wall cabinet, took out a fresh pad, and began writing with the kind of precision that came from habit, not confidence. No wasted words. No decoration. Just the facts: patient currently unstable, emotional support animal approved under clinical discretion, patient response observed and documented, responsibility accepted by signing clinician. She paused once, pen hovering, then added a line about keeping the dog on a short lead and away from sterile supplies. The detail mattered. It was the kind of thing someone trusted to think ahead would include. Behind her, one of the younger nurses had gone still. Emily noticed the change without looking up, the silence, the way her shoulders had straightened, the way she was no longer pretending this was above her pay grade. "I'll get the blanket changed," the nurse said, already moving. No argument. No eye roll. Just action. Emily glanced over, gave a small nod, and the nurse took the signal like it mattered. It did. In one motion the room shifted from resistance to coordination. Mrs. Halstead saw it too. She reached for the bedside 4 pump, checked the line, then lowered the rate by one careful notch. Not because Emily had ordered her to, but because Emily's judgment had just become impossible to ignore. The patient's breathing had improved the moment the dog settled, and everyone in the room could see it. Not by much. Enough. That was the part that made it hard. Not a miracle. Evidence. Emily finished the note, tore off the top sheet, and signed her name at the bottom. The pen scratched loudly in the quiet. She handed the copy to Mrs. Halstead first. A simple move, but it was a handoff of trust, and both women understood that. "If they question it," Emily said, "I'll explain it myself." Mrs. Halstead accepted the paper, then looked at her for a long second. Something in her face softened, but not into praise. Into trust with conditions. "Then be ready," she said. "Because they will." At that moment, the patient's daughter appeared in the doorway, breathless from the hallway sprint, eyes wide before she had even crossed the threshold. She took in the leash, the dog, the sign chart, the tension in the room, and stopped cold. Her gaze locked on Emily. "You let him stay?" she asked, voice cracking between hope and fear. Emily did not reach for a comforting answer she could not promise. She only turned the chart slightly so the daughter could see the line she had written, then stepped aside and gave her the space to read it. The daughter's hand flew to her mouth. Her knees softened, and she bent toward the bed as if the sight of the dog beside her father had taken the air out of her. That was the consequence Emily could not take back now. The decision had left the chart and entered the family. If the patient improved, it would be because of that call. If he worsened, it would be because of it too. The responsibility no longer lived on paper. It lived in the room, in every face that had watched her make the choice. Then the hallway phone rang, and Mrs. Halstead answered on the first ring. Emily caught only her side of the conversation. Yes, she signed it herself. Yes, the dog is still in the room. No, he is not being a disruption, because the patient recognized him. A pause. Her jaw tightened. No, I'm not moving him until I see a reason to. When she hung up, the silence felt heavier than before. Admin is on their way, she said. And family is coming with them. Emily looked back at Ranger, then at the patient's trembling hand resting in the fur, and understood what had changed. This was no longer about whether the dog could stay. It was about whether she could stand behind the choice when the people with the authority to punish her arrived to make her answer for it. The first thing Emily noticed was not the door opening. It was the way Mrs. Halstead's shoulders squared before she turned, as if the phone call had already become a decision no one could argue with. Two administrators stepped into the room behind her, one with a tablet, the other with that polished, bloodless expression people wore when they had never had to kneel beside a patient and choose. We need the animal removed, the younger one said, eyes fixed on Ranger. And we need the room cleared while we review the chart. The patient made a thin, frightened sound and tightened his fingers in Ranger's fur. Emily did not move first. She watched the monitor. The pulse had been climbing, then flattening in tiny, dangerous steps. The man had stopped looking at the dog like a comfort and started looking at him like a lifeline. Emily slid one hand under the blanket, checked the tremor in his wrist, then looked up and said, calm and even, if you move him right now, you will lose your window. The administrator frowned. We're not discussing windows. We're discussing policy. Policy doesn't stop a vasovagal crash, Emily answered. She reached for the basin, then paused when the patient tried to lift his hand. He was too weak to hold it up, but he managed to press two fingers once against Ranger's collar before letting them fall. That tiny motion changed the room. Mrs. Halstead saw it too. She did not ask permission. She stepped in, adjusted the bed angle 3 degrees, and said, let her work. It was the first victory, and it came without a speech. Emily tucked the blanket tighter around the patient's legs, lowered her own voice until it matched his breathing, and began giving short instructions the way a person might handhold someone across a ledge, in through the nose. Hold. Now out. She noticed the way his eyes tracked only one thing at a time, so she removed everything unnecessary from his field of view, including the tablet, including the bright overhead lamp. The nurse at the foot of the bed hesitated, then copied her movement without being asked. Ranger stayed still, chin on the mattress, as if he understood the stakes. Within a minute, the patient's pulse stopped jumping. The color returned in a faint wash to his mouth. He did not relax completely, but he stopped slipping away. Emily exhaled only once, silently, and the older administrator's expression hardened because he had seen it too. This was not luck. This was control. The chart was checked again, and the room changed shape around her. Mrs. Halstead stopped standing between Emily and the doorway and started standing beside her instead. She's staying on this case, she said. If you want to argue, do it after the patient is stable. The younger administrator began to protest, but the patient's hand moved again, this time not for the dog. He reached toward Emily's sleeve, caught the cuff, and held on with surprising force. It was a small thing, but everyone saw it. Trust had chosen a side. Emily met the man's eyes and saw fear there, not of pain anymore, but of being made to let go. That look touched something old and tight inside her chest, and for a second her hand stilled on the blanket. Then she resumed, firmer this time, because memory had its own discipline. When the room's tension began to rise again, Mrs. Halstead made the next call. She ordered the side door kept closed, asked security to hold the hallway, and told the administrators they would get their review after the patient was through the next 10 minutes. That should have bought Emily time. Instead, it raised the pressure. The younger administrator was already speaking into his headset when the monitor gave a sudden, shallow dip. Emily saw it before anyone else did. Not an emergency yet. A warning. She reached for the patient's hand, and when she felt the cold start at his fingertips, she made her decision at once. No one was removing Ranger, not now, not while the man's breathing remained tethered to the dog's presence. Turn him slightly left, Emily said. Now. The nurse hesitated only a beat before obeying. Ranger shifted with the bed, steady as stone. The patient swallowed, coughed once, and stayed with them. That was the second proof, and it was enough to change the room's physics. The nurse at the foot of the bed started responding before Emily finished each sentence. Mrs. Halstead moved the chart to Emily's reach without being asked. Even the administrator with the tablet lowered it. But the relief lasted only a moment. Because from the hallway came a different sound now, footsteps, measured and fast, and a man's voice saying the family was here. The patient heard it too. His fingers clenched around Ranger's fur so hard his knuckles whitened. Emily looked at the doorway, then back at the man, and understood the cost of what came next. Staying calm would no longer be enough. She would have to defend the choice in front of the people who loved him most. The door opened, and a woman in a rain-dark coat stopped cold at the sight of her father alive, Ranger beside him, and Emily still holding the line as if she had been placed there for that exact moment. The woman in the rain-dark coat did not step fully into the room. She stopped just inside the doorway, one hand still on the handle, as if the sight of her father alive had pinned her there. Emily saw the tremor first, not in the woman's voice, she had not spoken yet, but in the slight rise and fall of her chest, in the way her eyes locked on the wheelchair, on Ranger's head pressed against the old man's ribs, on the blanket Emily had folded around him with the care of a nurse who knew how fragile hope could be. The daughter's gaze moved to Emily last, and when it did, it was not anger exactly. It was the look of someone trying to decide whether she had arrived in time for a miracle or too late for a betrayal. "Dad," she whispered. The old man's mouth opened, but the words stuck. Emily did not move away from the bedside. She kept one hand on the man's forearm, steady and light, making it clear without saying it that she was not the one who had made this difficult. He needed warmth, Emily said quietly. And he needed someone who would stay with him when the pain spiked. The daughter's eyes flicked to the monitor, then to the chart in Mrs. Halstead's hands, then to the administrator standing strangely silent with his tablet lowered like a shield he no longer needed. That was the first pressure shift. The room was no longer asking whether the patient had survived the night, but whether Emily had overstepped her place. The daughter came farther in, rain dripping from her coat hem to the floor, and Ranger lifted his head at once, ears pricking as if he recognized the grief before the woman even spoke. He did not bark. He only shifted, making room. The old man drew a ragged breath and reached, not for Emily, but for his daughter's sleeve. She took it with both hands. "Why didn't anyone call me sooner?" she asked, and the question landed on Emily like a weight. Mrs. Halstead glanced at the chart, then at Emily, then back to the daughter, and the answer formed in the silence between them, because the call had been made, and because no one had believed there would be time. Emily saw that realization settle over the daughter's face, and the anger changed shape. It was no longer at Emily. It was at the delay, at the fear, at the world that had made room for paperwork before family. Still, the choice in front of Emily tightened. The father's pulse was fragile, his breathing uneven, and every minute now belonged to a family that had been denied the truth of his condition. If Emily stayed in the center of it, she risked being seen as the woman who had inserted herself into a private crisis. If she stepped back, the patient's daughter might interpret that retreat as guilt. She looked at the old man's hand, then at Ranger, then at the daughter, and made the harder choice. She lifted the chart and turned it toward the family. "He's not out of danger," she said. But he's with us. If you want to stay, I'll tell you exactly what happens next. That simple sentence changed the room more than any explanation could have. The daughter let out a shaky breath and nodded once, the smallest surrender and the first real trust she had offered. Emily pointed to the medications, to the timing, to the pain response, and as she spoke, the daughter's eyes narrowed, not in suspicion, but in recognition of details she clearly understood enough to know Emily was not guessing. The hidden clue did not announce itself like a badge, it emerged in the way Emily handled the chart, in the order of her questions, in the calm efficiency with which she predicted the father's next decline before the monitor did. She had been right twice before the family had even fully entered the room, and now she was right in front of them in a way that felt practiced, almost too practiced. Mrs. Halstead noticed it too. The administrator stopped pretending to be invisible. Even the daughter's posture changed, shoulders easing by a fraction as she realized Emily was not simply compassionate, she was disciplined in a way that looked trained, maybe even hardened. That perception reversal cut through the room. Emily was not clinging to the patient out of sentiment. She was staying because she could carry the burden no one else here could yet hold. And that made leaving her side feel riskier than staying. The father turned his head toward his daughter, trying to speak, and Emily saw the effort cost him. She made a quick adjustment, lowered the bed angle, and eased Ranger farther back so he would not crowd the man's chest. The dog obeyed with unusual precision, settling at Emily's knee as if she were the one issuing silent orders. The daughter saw that too. Her gaze moved from Ranger to Emily's face, and then the final consequence landed. Whatever this woman was, she had not only stabilized her father, she had become part of the decision-making around him. That could not be undone now. The daughter took one step closer to the bed, then looked at Emily and asked the question that changed the weight in the room completely. If I let you keep leading this, what exactly are you asking me to trust? Emily held her eyes, felt the room narrow to that one impossible line, and answered with the truth she could not soften anymore. That your father does better when someone stays calm enough to see what comes next. The daughter nodded, but the answer carried a cost. From that moment on, Emily was no longer just a nurse who happened to be present. She was the person this family would remember if anything went wrong, and the room had just handed her that responsibility. Outside the open doorway, another set of footsteps slowed, then stopped, as if someone had heard enough to know this was no longer a private conversation. Emily did not look back. She kept her hand on the chart, her voice steady, and began the next step of care knowing full well that the family was watching her every move and that stepping away now would look like abandonment. The door remained open. The room had barely finished absorbing Emily's words when the monitor on the wall gave a thin, impatient beep. The father's blood pressure dipped again, not enough to crash, but enough to turn the family's fear into something sharper. Emily's eyes flicked to the numbers once, then to the man in the bed, then to the daughter standing so close she could feel the heat of the bedside lamp. Without asking permission, Emily stepped in, lowered the 4-line a fraction, and checked the dressing with 2 fingers that moved with practiced calm. The daughter watched her hands more than her face. The movement was small, but it changed the room. The father's breathing eased by degrees, not suddenly, not like a miracle, but like a body recognizing steadiness and deciding to follow it. The daughter's shoulders dropped on a quiet exhale, and the mother, who had been ready to challenge every word, reached out and gripped the rail as if she had finally found something solid to hold. Emily did not announce what she was doing. She did not narrate the numbers. She simply corrected one thing, then another, and the tension in the room began to bend around her instead of against her. That was the first twist no one could ignore. This family had come in expecting a nurse to stay in the background, but now the daughter was looking at Emily like she was the only person in the room whose judgment mattered. Emily felt it happen immediately, and it cost her something. The easy distance was gone. If she walked away now, she would not just be leaving a chart, she would be leaving the weight of their trust behind her. So when the daughter asked, softer this time, whether her father was going to be all right, Emily did not promise what she could not know. She took one slow breath, kept her voice even, and said she would stay until the next turn in his condition was clear. It was not comfort. It was responsibility. And once she said it, the room quietly accepted her as part of the family's defense against whatever came next. The older nurse at the doorway had seen enough to stop pretending she was only observing. She had noticed the way Emily kept scanning the patient's left side before anyone else did, the way she caught the slightest change in color near the mouth before the monitor changed, the way she had corrected the line without breaking eye contact with the family. None of that proved anything by itself. But together it built a picture that could not be dismissed. The older nurse moved closer, not with suspicion now, but with the careful respect of someone recognizing a standard she had not expected to meet on this shift. Emily felt that shift too, and it made her choice harder. Because once the room looked to her for answers, she could not step back into the anonymity she had been protecting. The father made a rough sound and tried to turn away from the pain pulling at his chest. Emily immediately placed a hand near his shoulder, not touching too much, just enough to anchor him, and asked him to match her breathing. 1 breath in. 1 breath out. The daughter copied her without being told. Then the mother did too. For a few seconds, 3 people were breathing in the rhythm Emily set, and the room stopped feeling like a collapse waiting to happen. That was the payoff, and it was bigger than any one measurement on a screen. The family's panic gave way to trust because Emily did not fight their fear with force, only with calm they could borrow. But the cost came right behind it. The father's condition stabilized only enough to reveal what Emily had been afraid of from the beginning, a complication that was not going to resolve with patience alone. She caught it in the way his hand tightened once and then went strangely still, in the way the daughter saw her glance toward the chart and immediately understood not to ask aloud. Emily needed another step, and it was not a gentle one. She had to choose between keeping the family comforted with half a truth or telling them enough to make them afraid of what came next. She chose honesty. The words were measured, but they landed hard. They needed to move now, and moving meant the night was no longer under control. The daughter stared at her for a long second, then looked at her father, then back at Emily, and something in that look changed. Not trust alone. Dependence. Emily had become the person they would follow, whether she wanted that or not. The older nurse stepped in to help with the transfer, and as she did, her hand brushed the edge of Emily's sleeve. She caught a glimpse of an old scar near the wrist, a small thing, easily missed, but the older nurse saw the reflex that came with it, the instant repositioning, the instinctive protection of the arm, the way Emily's body always seemed to place itself between threat and patient. The recognition was not full, not even close, but it was real enough to quiet the room. The nurse did not say war. She did not say soldier. She simply nodded once, as if she had confirmed something she did not need to name. That small nod was the second reversal, and it changed the burden on Emily's shoulders. No one was going to let her remain only a visitor after this. When the transport team arrived, Emily did not step aside. She moved with them, guided the gurney through the open door, and held the daughter's gaze until the last possible moment. The family followed because they trusted her now, and that trust made the hallway feel narrower, like there was no easy way back. At the elevator, the father's monitor gave another warning pulse, and Emily made the decision that sealed the night. She climbed in with him. Not because anyone ordered her to, and not because she wanted attention, but because she knew this was the only way to keep the situation from slipping into fear again. The doors closed before the daughter could ask if she was allowed to come too. Emily was already inside, hands steady, eyes forward, carrying the weight of a family's faith and the knowledge that once this ride started, she would no longer be able to disappear into the background afterward. Emily stayed with the father as the elevator doors slid shut, and the hospital's soft hum gave way to the tight, metallic silence inside the car. The monitor blinked again, slower this time, and she shifted her body just enough to keep the stretcher steady with one hand while the other checked the 4-line, then the oxygen tubing, then the patient's jaw. The daughter stood on the other side of the doors, her face gone pale through the narrowing gap, and Emily lifted 2 fingers in a small, steady signal, "Keep breathing, stay with me." The father's lips moved, but the words were lost under the elevator's rise. Emily leaned closer, not to hear him, but to read the shape of the panic in his face. She had seen that look before, years ago, under different lights and louder machines, when fear made people forget how to trust their own bodies. The elevator stopped at a floor that was not the one she had asked for. The doors opened, and a pair of orderlies stared in, surprised to find her there, alone and already in command of the air around the patient. One of them started to speak, then saw the father's monitor and stepped back without another word. Emily did not waste a second explaining herself. She adjusted the blanket, checked the pressure on the blood pressure cuff, and guided the stretcher out before the hesitation in the hallway could spread to the family waiting behind them. The mistake had not been hers, but the responsibility was. When the father's rhythm dipped again near the transfer bay, she caught it before the machine alarm fully rose and pressed 2 fingers to his wrist, matching his pulse with her own calm until his breathing followed. The daughter arrived a heartbeat later, stopping short when she saw how close her father had come to slipping away while everyone else was still trying to decide who had the authority to move. For one brief second, the girl looked at Emily the way people looked at a stranger they had just realized had been carrying them all along. Then the daughter's shoulders dropped, and she stepped in close enough to hold her father's hand. That was the first change, small but real, not gratitude, not yet, but trust given before it was comfortable. Emily felt it land on her like weight. It was easier when people doubted her. Doubt had boundaries. Trust asked more. In the transfer room, the physician on call finally caught up, out of breath and irritated, already reaching for control. He began with a sharp question, but stopped when he saw the father stabilize under Emily's hands without drama, without noise, without a single wasted motion. He looked from the chart to her face, then back to the monitor, and something in his expression shifted from annoyance to caution. He was no longer asking whether she belonged there. He was trying to understand how much of the night she had already been carrying without saying a word. Emily did not answer him directly. She simply handed off the line, then pointed to one small detail in the chart that had changed the treatment path before the crisis could deepen. It was a quiet correction, but it mattered. The physician followed it, and the father's number steadied again. A nurse at the doorway saw the exchange, saw the doctor's posture soften, and quietly moved closer to Emily instead of away. Respect had arrived in the room, not as praise, but as behavior. And with it came the harder part. The daughter asked if Emily would stay while they moved him upstairs, and before Emily could refuse, the father squeezed her hand once, weak but clear. He was not asking for procedure. He was asking for her. Emily knew what that meant. Staying would mean the family saw more than a calm face and steady hands. It would mean giving them access to the part of her she kept buried under competence, the part that knew exactly how close a life could come to breaking, and why she never allowed herself to panic when it did. It would also mean delaying the only clean exit she still had. She could leave now and disappear back into the night like she always had, or she could remain visible long enough for every question to land. She chose the second. She pulled up a chair beside the bed, stayed in the line of sight, and took responsibility not just for the patient, but for the fear gathering around him. The hallway outside grew quieter. Even the doctor's voice lowered when he came back in, and he addressed her with care instead of command. But the choice had a cost. As the father settled and the daughter rested her head briefly against the rail, a supervisor at the door asked Emily for her full name and employee record before the transfer could continue. It was a routine request, but this time it hit differently. Emily paused just long enough for the room to feel it. She gave the name. The words were simple. The silence after them was not. The supervisor's eyes stayed on her a second too long, as if matching what he heard to something he had almost recognized before. Emily understood then that she had crossed a line she could not uncross. She had become visible, not to the whole hospital, but to exactly the kind of person who would start asking the right questions. And if she kept the promise she had made to the family, she would have to stay visible long enough to answer them. The father's breathing had barely steadied when the corridor outside changed. Not louder, just sharper. Emily felt it first, before anyone spoke. A cartwheel stopped. A nurse glanced toward the door and didn't move again. Then two men in hospital security jackets appeared at the end of the hall, not rushing, just arriving with the kind of purpose that made every person in range straighten without meaning to. One of them held a tablet. The other kept his eyes on Emily's hands. The supervisor by the door cleared his throat and said her full name again, slower this time, as if repetition might make it ordinary. Emily didn't look at him. She tightened the blanket around the daughter's shoulders, checked the father's foreline with 2 quick fingers, and shifted the chair so the girl could stay tucked close without falling asleep against the metal rail. Those small movements did more than comfort. They made a decision. The supervisor asked for her employee record. Emily answered with the same calm she had used all night, after he's transferred safely. The man frowned, ready to push, but the daughter lifted her head, eyes wet and alert now, and held onto Emily's sleeve with a grip that said plainly what her voice could not. "Don't take her away yet." Emily saw it, and she made the harder choice. She turned back to the father, lifted the corner of his blanket, checked the oxygen tubing once more, and then leaned to the daughter's ear. "Stay with him," she whispered. "Don't let him wake up alone." The girl nodded, and fear gave way to purpose in her face. That was the first payoff, not a salute, not a name, but trust. The supervisor tried again, quieter but firmer, and this time Emily finally looked up. The security men noticed the motion at the same time, the way her left wrist flexed, the old scar beneath the watchband, the instinctive scan of exits, the habit of measuring distance, the stillness that wasn't weakness at all. One of them paused on the folder in his hand. There, on the top page, was the same surname, the same transfer notation, and a line item he had clearly not expected to matter. His eyes narrowed, then dropped to Emily's wrist, where the watch had slipped just enough to show a thin black mark near the bone, a faded unit stamp so small it would have been invisible to anyone who didn't know how to look. The room changed. Not because anyone announced it, but because the man with the tablet stopped talking mid-sentence. He looked from the paper to Emily and back again, and something in his posture went rigid. The daughter saw it too. She looked from his face to Emily's wrist, then to the father's settled breathing, and she understood before the words came. Emily had not been standing beside them by accident. She had not been just anything. The supervisor said her last name in a different tone now, lower, almost careful. Emily placed one hand on the father's shoulder and the other on the daughter's hand, keeping both anchored while the transfer team assembled outside the room. The security men stepped closer, no longer to remove her, but to make space. One of them quietly moved the clipboard away from the bed so she wouldn't have to reach around it. That was the bigger consequence, visibility. The hidden thing had surfaced, and with it came a weight she could not set down. Because the moment people realized she knew exactly how to hold a crisis still, they would also expect her to keep doing it. The father suddenly stirred, his eyes fluttering open for one breathless second, and Emily leaned in before anyone else could. He looked at her, confused, then at his daughter, who was crying now without sound. Emily pressed his hand once, steady and sure, and he squeezed back with the last strength he had. Around them, the transfer team waited on her timing. Even the supervisor held his breath. Emily gave the order with no authority in her voice and all of it in her actions: lift on my count. Slow. Keep him level. They obeyed. It was not the badge that made them move. It was the fact that she had already proven she would not let him be dropped, delayed, or frightened. When they started toward the door, the daughter rose too quickly and nearly stumbled. Emily caught her elbow, guided her step by step, and handed her the father's discharge paperwork like it was something precious. The girl stared at Emily's face as if trying to memorize it. "Will you come with us?" she asked. Emily's answer was almost a whisper. "As far as they'll let me." That was the emotional peak, because everyone in the hall heard what she did not say: not forever. Not enough. Just as far as duty allowed. The transfer team rolled the father out, the daughter walking beside the stretcher with Emily at her shoulder until the hallway narrowed at the elevator bank. There, a second nurse, one who had mocked her earlier, stepped in front of her path, not to block her now, but to hand her the father's chart and avoid her eyes while doing it. An apology without words. Emily took it, and the gesture cost her nothing less than the old life she had been trying to keep invisible. As the elevator doors closed, the supervisor finally spoke again, softer than before, "We're going to need your statement." Emily looked at the reflected faces in the metal doors, then down at the daughter's trembling hands still wrapped around hers, and she knew the truth of the next hour had already begun. Outside the elevator, someone was waiting to ask the questions that would not let her stay hidden much longer. As the elevator doors sealed the hallway behind them, the sound of the ward seemed to fall away with it. Emily stood half a step behind the stretcher, one hand still resting near the father's shoulder as if to anchor him through the moving metal box. Across from her, the daughter kept both hands locked around the chart the second nurse had placed there, holding it like it might vanish if she blinked. No one spoke at first. The supervisor, who had once sounded so certain while questioning Emily in front of everyone, now watched the floor numbers climb with a different kind of attention, quiet, careful, almost protective. At the next stop, the doors opened onto a brighter corridor, and instead of rushing past, a transport aide moved aside with one clear motion of the arm, making space before Emily even had to ask. It was small, but it was new. Emily noticed it, and so did the daughter. The girl's breathing eased by a fraction, and that change traveled through the elevator like a soft wave. When the stretcher rolled out, the father's hand slipped from the blanket and caught Emily's sleeve for one brief second. Not to hold her back. To keep her there. In the admitting area, the same nurse who had mocked her earlier took the chart back with both hands, this time without meeting Emily's eyes, but when the daughter stumbled at the threshold, that nurse reached out and steadied her before she fell. No apology, no speech, just a hand offered at the right moment. Emily signed the transfer note, then paused when she saw the father's pulse still tied to the monitor, the rhythm steady enough to matter, fragile enough to remind her what had been won. The supervisor waited for her beside the desk, not crowding her now, leaving the pen where she could take it or refuse it. Emily took it. She added one line, then another, the ink slow and precise. Her fingers moved the way they always had when she was tired, controlled, exact, unwilling to waste a single motion. The daughter leaned in, watching every stroke, and when Emily finished, the girl's shoulders dropped as if someone had finally set down a weight she had been carrying alone. That was the first time she cried, not loud, not breaking, just one tear and then another, because for the first time all night she could see her father as a man still being fought for, not a case already lost. Emily looked at her, then at the line of nurses who had gathered at a respectful distance, and for a moment the whole station held still around that simple scene, one exhausted woman, one terrified daughter, one chart, one breathing father, one room learning how to be gentler. Then the daughter did something smaller than gratitude and heavier than any speech. She reached into her coat pocket, pulled out the father's old metal dog tag on its faded chain, and placed it into Emily's palm. Emily closed her fingers around it, and her expression changed only slightly, just enough for the daughter to see the cost behind her composure, just enough for the room to understand that being seen did not make the past lighter. It only made the burden visible. The supervisor noticed that too and said nothing. Instead, he stepped to the side and directed the next transfer himself, his voice lower than before, more careful around the people in the hallway. The nurse who had once mocked Emily took the chart board and organized the notes without being asked. The transport aide adjusted the stretcher straps before the family even requested it. Each small motion spread outward, one person after another choosing precision, patience, and restraint because Emily had already shown them what those things looked like under pressure. Near the end of the corridor, the father opened his eyes. He could not speak much, but when he saw Emily standing there with the dog tag in her hand, he gave the faintest nod, a recognition so simple it nearly broke the silence around them. Emily answered with one small tilt of her head and then, instead of staying for the thank you that hovered in the air, she placed the tag back into the daughter's hand and covered it with her own for 1 second longer than necessary. A promise without words. Then she stepped back, letting the family take the space she had fought to give them. As the stretcher rolled on, the daughter walked beside it with a steadier pace than before, and the staff around them made room without being told. By the time they disappeared through the next set of doors, the hallway had changed shape around them. Not wider. Kinder. Emily stood alone for a beat, shoulders still tight, eyes tired, the echo of everything she had carried still sitting behind her ribs. Then she turned to the chart desk, picked up the next file, and went back to work. Around her, the room moved differently now, quieter, more deliberate, more willing to trust the person who had never asked for trust in the first place. And in the nurse's handoff tray, resting on top of the clean forms, the old dog tag chain lay neatly folded, ready to be returned to the family with the same care it had been given. By the time the hallway settled, the day had already moved on. Phones rang again. Monitors kept beeping. Wheels kept rolling over polished tile. But something in the unit had shifted for good. At the chart desk, the charge nurse who had once stood stiff and doubtful now reached for the waiting list with both hands and began rearranging it without a word, sliding the most fragile patients closer to the top before anyone had to ask. A resident who used to talk over the text paused long enough to check a blood pressure cuff himself, then set it back on the counter instead of tossing it aside. In the corner, the younger nurse who had watched Emily work with narrow eyes earlier quietly took the folded blanket from the supply bin and laid it over an elderly man's legs before he even stirred. No one announced the change. No one needed to. It moved through the room the way warm light moves across a wall, soft, steady, undeniable. Emily saw it only in pieces as she finished the handoff, signed the last line, and tucked the old dog tag chain deeper into the clean tray so it would not slip off the edge. She did not linger for thanks. She did not wait for anyone to name what she had done. She simply turned back toward the ER, where the next stretch of work was already forming, and took the next file when it was placed in her hand. Near the trauma bay, the daughter from earlier returned with a paper cup of water that had gone untouched in her palm for several minutes. She set it beside the stretcher rail, then adjusted her father's blanket one more time with fingers that no longer trembled. A nurse beside her reached out and wordlessly helped lift the 4 lines so it would not pull. Nothing grand. Just care passed from one pair of hands to the next. In the supply room, the old scrub jacket Emily had left on the hook still hung there, sleeve straight, pocket worn, the same quiet shape as before, yet when the housekeeping attendant passed it, she slowed, straightened it carefully, and moved on without being asked. Even the station printer seemed to understand the mood, spitting out labels one at a time instead of in noisy bursts. Later, when the shift changed and the floor grew a little less crowded, Emily finally sat for the first time in hours on the bench outside the med room. She eased one shoulder, then the other, and looked down at the chain in her hand. The metal caught the fluorescent light, plain and dull and real. She thumbed it once, then folded it into the inside pocket of her jacket instead of putting it away in Lost and Found. That was the choice she made at the end of the night, small, deliberate, entirely hers. Not to hand it off. Not to make it official. To carry it one more day, just long enough to return it herself when morning came and the family was ready. When she stood again, the hall had not emptied, but it had softened around her. A stretcher nurse guided a wheelchair around a tired father without bumping his footrests. The resident from earlier held the door with his elbow for a janitor pushing a heavy cart. The younger nurse who had once been eager to impress now waited until an anxious child finished speaking before she bent to answer. And Emily, already moving, already back to work, crossed the floor at an even pace, one hand near her pocket, one eye on the next patient, still choosing the slower path whenever it meant someone else could breathe easier. At the far end of the corridor, the daughter from earlier looked up just once and found the sight of Emily passing beneath the lights without ceremony, still ordinary, still steady, still there. Then the elevator doors opened, a fresh set of wheels rolled out, and the night kept going.